Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Brian Goldstone, journalist and author of There Is No Place for Us, Working in Homeless in America. Brian, welcome to the program.
It's really great to be with you.
Let's start with just sort of, you've written basically an ethnography in many respects, 5 families, let's just sort of take some of the broader pictures. You write about Atlanta, but Atlanta is, I think in many respects, certainly, according to like indicative of a dynamic that we have going on in the country. But maybe we should just start with the idea of like what you believe is the delta between the official numbers of homelessness and what the actual numbers are.
Yeah, I was shocked to discover in the course of reporting this book and researching it over the 5-6 years, I was really, really shocked to discover that as bad as the official numbers on homelessness are, and it's important to note that in the last 2 years, we've seen the highest level of homelessness on record, according to the official count. As bad as those official numbers are, the reality is exponentially worse. There is this entire world of homelessness, what I refer to in the book as a kind of shadow realm of homelessness that we're not seeing, that is not just out of sight and invisible, but that has been actively rendered invisible. And I point out in the book, by cobbling together different data sources, that the true number of those who are unhoused right now in this country is, and this is a conservative estimate, about 6 times greater than the official number. So we're talking a catastrophe of truly unprecedented proportions. And I think that is just, while the book is based in Atlanta, the reality is that this truly is a nationwide crisis, and it reaches into every single corner of this country.
And so we should say, like, the official number is somewhere in the 700,000s. And so, your sense is that it's closer to over 4 million people. And I want to get to the Trump executive order, because on some level, like the rendered invisible, it seems to be the fundamental driving principle of that executive order is to how can we make this this problem seem even more distant, I guess, in many respects. But let's start with, how did you choose? There were 4 families.
5,
excuse me. And how did you choose these 5?
Yeah, it was less a matter, I think, of me choosing them than the question of like, who is going to allow me into their life in such a way that readers will experience what it looks like and what it feels like for parents, for their kids, when this most basic human necessity is always out of reach. And the book actually had its genesis in a magazine story that I reported and wrote for the New Republic over a period of about 7 months. And while I was reporting that book, I was just meeting tons and tons of families and individuals who were working some more, and it still wasn't enough to keep themselves and their children housed. Some journalists have a problem of, like, they have the story and then they need to find someone who is going to exemplify that story, who's going to carry it. For me, the problem wasn't like who is going to exemplify this. It's how do you narrow it down? There are so many people, not just in Atlanta, but again, across the country. And so, it was really a matter of meeting dozens of families, dozens of individuals, and through the course of just getting to know them and building trust, figuring out like who has space in their life for someone to just be immersing themselves, in their day-to-day lives. And that was really the aspiration for this book, was to just immerse myself in their day-to-day lives as much as humanly possible. And that's a pretty tall order for anyone, but especially for people who are already, completely, to put it mild, maxed out with stress, with anxiety, trying to keep themselves housed and to find housing.
And what I was struck with is there are so many different, it feels like, I mean, just from these 5 examples, paths to this homeless. Now, a couple of them at least end up in almost the same scenario, particularly with these extended stay hotels, which is a story in and of itself in many respects. But let's start with, for instance, Celeste, because she was, I mean, lots of challenges she's dealing with, but her homelessness was a function of a landlord essentially trying to, I guess, take advantage of her house burning down by charging her. Her house burns down that she's renting.
Yeah.
And then he, without her knowledge, evicts her. She's obviously not in the house, but files an eviction notice without her awareness. And that just sort of like makes it impossible for her to get into other housing. Walk us through this story.
Yeah. Her story really illustrates why over the last few years of working on this, it has just driven me nuts to hear people talk about, families and individuals in America falling into homelessness. They are being pushed. And Celeste's story, as I think all of the family stories in the book show us, that this was a matter of being pushed. This wasn't a matter of falling. Her story, as you mentioned, begins in this really dramatic way, a very singular way, with her rental home burning down. It was later discovered that an abusive ex set fire to this rental home. She had recently taken a restraining order out on him. But even though it was this fire that was sort of the first domino that fell, it wasn't the fire that caused Celeste and her children to become homeless. It was the fact that, as you said, months after the house fire, she came to learn that her landlord, which was not a mom and pop landlord, it was a private equity firm called the Prager Group. They own tens of thousands of rental units across the South. The Prager Group demanded, when her home burned down, that she pay rent not only for that current month. The fire had happened at the beginning of the month. She hadn't yet paid her rent. Not only pay that current month's rent, but an additional month as well in order to be released from her lease. She, of course, refused to do that. She thought that was the end of it. And then months later, when she was applying for other apartments, was denied because of an eviction on her record. In Georgia, she didn't even have to be notified that an eviction had been filed against her. She didn't have to be notified in person. The sheriff was able to carry out what's called a tack and mail dispossessory. And when she went to the burned down home, which still hadn't been repaired, in the mailbox on the eviction notice was written by the sheriff, served to fire destroyed property. So, when I've told friends and colleagues about this story over the years, they say, oh, that's so tragic that, domestic violence, this house fire led to them becoming homeless. No, what led to them becoming homeless was a housing system that prioritizes, that has enabled firms like the Prager Group to prioritize profit over all else, over just the basic necessity for a place to live, that has so stacked the cards against tenants and given landlords all of the power. That is what pushed Celeste and her children into homelessness.
And she had 2 children. She was then subsequently diagnosed with if I remember correctly, ovarian and breast cancer. And then she's looking for assistance. And this I found also just sort of stunning. Just walk us through her timeline briefly.
Yeah. So after the fire, after realizing with the eviction that her credit score has been tanked, that this 3-digit number that has come to determine whether millions of people in this country have access to housing and other basic necessities, when she realizes that her credit score is in effect locking her out of the formal housing market and essentially destroying any chance she has of getting back into housing, even if she can't afford it, she does what scores of other families have done. And she, in the absence of any family shelters, she went to an extended stay hotel. And And this place at first was a kind of refuge for her, but she realizes over the next few weeks and then months that she has fallen into what people refer to as the hotel trap, that she has landed in what another family in the book calls an expensive prison. This extended stay hotel is basically an extremely profitable homeless shelter, and they are proliferating across the country. As it happens, private equity firms aren't just buying up the homes that people currently live in, the rental housing. They're also increasingly buying up the very places that families like Celeste are forced into once they become homeless. And so Blackstone and Starwood Capital, during the time that Celeste was living at this squalid extended stay hotel, they purchased Extended Stay America, the largest chain of extended stay hotels, for $6 billion, because they saw how extremely profitable all this precarity has become. So Celeste is desperate to get out of this hotel. She is desperate to get out. And finally, after refusing the term homeless for herself, she really wanted to kind of resist that label, because she had this kind of like name it and claim it theology, where if she put that label on herself, she would sort of become that in a very deep way. But finally, she's just desperate to get out. She's having to choose between going to her chemo appointment for ovarian and breast cancer to treat that cancer, or going to her warehouse job. And just one quick side note, this book is about the rise of the working homeless. And it's very important that we attend not only to the homeless side of that equation, but the working side as well. Because in Celeste's case, it wasn't just the poverty wages that she was earning at this warehouse job. It was the fact that she had no sick leave. She had no benefits, no health insurance. So if she doesn't go to work, she doesn't get paid. If she doesn't get paid, she and her children go from being in this room out on the street, and she goes to Gateway Center, the coordinated entry point to access homeless services in Atlanta. Every city in the country and municipality has their own version of Gateway, where you have to go to try to obtain services. And she is told that despite her cancer, she is not vulnerable enough. Her vulnerability score is too low to qualify for assistance. And in fact, she's told that because she is not in a shelter or on the street, she does not fit the definition of literal homelessness. That is HUD's sort of way of policing who counts as homeless. And none of the families I write about in this book are counted as homeless. None of them fit the official definition. And Celeste leaves Gateway Center that day completely empty-handed. She's actually told, when she says, fine, we'll go to a shelter. And if that's what we have to do to be considered homeless, we'll go to a shelter. And the caseworker stops. She says, ma'am, actually, you mentioned that your son just turned 15. Celeste says, yeah. And the caseworker says, I'm sorry, none of the family shelters in Georgia allow boys over the age of 13. So he would have to go to a men's shelter by himself. And of course, she's not going to split up her family, and she leaves empty-handed. And that is what, it's bad enough to be homeless. The only thing worse than being homeless in America is not even earning the designation homeless, because then you literally don't count. Your experience is written out of the story we tell about homelessness, and you are denied any form of assistance.
Can I ask you a bit more about shelters and the role that they play in defining homelessness? A lot of accounts that we'll hear just up here in New York are that homeless shelters, there's a lot of lack of safety. People are fearful of being robbed, and it still is quite similar up north here, that like you need to be able to be in a shelter to have certain designations. Like, when you speak to these people, what have been the broad experiences with shelters? And if you could clarify how that fits into how homelessness is defined legally.
Yeah, so just to get to the definition first, so every year when the point in time count is conducted, which is the federal government's official homeless census, where volunteers across the country fan out to count everyone who is experiencing homelessness, only those who are in shelters or on the street are counted. And so that has existed since 2005. And every year, when the point in time count results come out and those numbers are they then appear in newspaper headlines. Those headlines are reflecting what I would argue is just a very tiny sliver of the total homeless population. Here in DeKalb County in Georgia, where I live, which is one of the most populous counties in the South, right now there is not a single shelter for families in the entire county. So when you don't have shelter, to put it in very real terms, if you have one shelter in a city and you count everyone who is living in that shelter, that year that the point in time count is conducted, those families would count as homeless. If you close that shelter today, those families will go from being homeless to no longer being homeless simply because they are no longer in that shelter. If they're not on the street, if they do what families do, which is go in their cars or start staying in the overcrowded apartments of others or to these hotels. So it's this very arbitrary and I think very cruel way of limiting the scope of homelessness in this country. We can imagine that there are very clear political motivations to narrow the scope in this way. But New York is exceptional in that there is a right to shelter in New York. So the shelter system is unusually and exceptionally sprawling and large. And many of the families who are homeless in New York are in that shelter system, even though in New York too, there's just a huge number of people who are excluded. But that really is exceptional. In the rest of the country, it's not just a matter that shelters are unsafe, that the conditions are abysmal. It's often the case that they simply don't exist, especially for families. And when they don't exist, or when families can't access them or don't want to access them for very good reasons, they literally don't count.
You have another story about Britt, who also has two kids, younger kids, and the story of housing vouchers. And this dynamic, it seems sort of on some level analogous. This idea of if there's no housing, if there's no shelters, then there's no homeless people. This also feels like a bureaucratic way of actually sort of ostensibly providing for unhoused people, but not ultimately having to by the sort of the context in which they offer. So walk us through what happens with Britt, who also ends up at an efficiency hotel. But I'm particularly the Section 8 voucher, but tell us that story.
Yeah, Britt is really interesting because through her own life trajectory, you can kind of tell the story of housing policy in America. Britt is, her roots in Atlanta go back 5 generations. When she was born, she and her family actually lived in public housing. And Atlanta was the first city in the country to build public housing, as it happens, in the 1930s. But by the time Britt was born, Atlanta had become the first city in the country to begin demolishing all of its public housing in favor of this neoliberal experiment in effectively leaving people's housing needs to the private market to meet and take care of. So Britt's family, as she's growing up, is displaced from the public housing where they live. And Britt, as a child, actually experiences homelessness with her mother living in these awful hotels and going from place to place, attending, I believe, 3 different schools in 1 year as a child. And she is determined as an adult with her own children to make a home for herself and her kids in the city. She's determined, not to leave. She also realizes that there is nowhere else to go for her because there really isn't anywhere that is more affordable, where she has family ties and so forth. And so, Britt, she everything for her hinges on the possibility of getting a housing voucher. And when the book opens, she has 2 years earlier won the voucher lottery. I think the fact that we even use the word lottery in relation to this absolutely essential form of assistance is telling. It says a lot about how we treat housing in America. But she wins the voucher lottery, and 2 years later, when the book opens, she's finally gotten off the waiting list. Here is the key to her having a home in the city, being able to afford it. what happens is that ultimately she can't find a landlord who will accept the voucher. There's a lot of talk within housing policy circles about how landlords discriminate against voucher holders for racist reasons, because of the stigma attached to those people, and that is certainly true. But what a lot of that discussion leaves out is how landlords are refusing to take vouchers in these hot rental markets because they simply don't have a financial incentive to, because they can't jack up rents at will. There's so much competition just for a single apartment that they can afford to refuse the subsidy. And when Britt ends up losing the voucher because it expires, the year that she loses her voucher, about 1,600 vouchers are issued to families in Atlanta, and 1,100 expire before they can be used. No landlord will accept it. That is what we did when we went from a model of public housing, of the government being directly involved in providing for housing, to leaving people's housing needs to the market and its whims.
That's just insane. That figure, that the 1,100 of the 1,600 expire. Obviously, these people have been waiting years to get these vouchers, and then they can't use them.
Yeah,
it's just insane. Let's also just one more example, because this is Maurice and Natalia. This is another example of sort of the industry that has been built around people's deprivation. I don't know how else to really say it. I mean, and the private equity stuff with both the owning the rental stock and then also owning the sort of like what happens when you lose the rental stock. It sort of feels like I don't know, somebody coming in and buying, like, we're going to buy all the dollar stores, and we're going to buy also I don't know what the Dollar Tree. And as people go from Dollar General to Dollar Tree because their pay gets cut or whatever it is, or the recession happens, we make money on both ends. But let's talk about Maurice and Natalia, because again, this is another situation where the building sold, they get booted, and then they end up having to get involved with Liberty Rent. And walk us through this, because this is also a crazy story.
Yeah, something I forgot to mention in relation to Britt's story that is definitely there for Maurice and Natalia as well is the way that, the backdrop for all of this in a city like Atlanta, and here Atlanta is absolutely representative of any number of cities across the country. The backdrop for all of this is a city that has undergone this much celebrated renaissance. An absolute, just transformation of its urban center, rampant gentrification, corporate profits are surging. The signs of growth in Atlanta are everywhere. And, and what we are seeing is that families like Britts, like Maurice and Natalia's, they're not just being pushed out of the neighborhoods they grew up in, they're being pushed out of housing altogether. So that's the backdrop. Maurice and Natalia, they actually grew up in DC, and they were priced out of their formerly Black working class neighborhood in DC and went to Atlanta as part of what has been termed the new Great Migration of people whose grandparents, great grandparents fled the Jim Crow South in search of economic opportunity in the North. They come back to Atlanta, to the South, to this Black Mecca, thinking they can achieve their middle class aspirations here, only come to find out, after living in their apartment for several years, stably housed, their landlord decides to terminate their lease prematurely because it's a great time to sell. Their home, they realize, has all along been an investment vehicle for their landlord. And at that point, that when their lease is terminated, they and their children they're pushed into what a caseworker in the book calls the housing Hunger Games. They realize that the ground has kind of shifted under their feet just in the time they've been renting in Atlanta. They're thrust into the housing Hunger Games, and in that context, their credit score is too low because of student debt. They are forced to use this co-signing company called Liberty Rent, where you're basically paying these outrageous fees in order to have this company co-sign in order to get you into an apartment. That actually does nothing to keep them in their apartment. They end up getting evicted when they are only a few days late on their rent. Their landlord, like Celestes, is a private equity firm, this one based in Nashville called Covenant Capital. And they have been employing this automated eviction system where if you're just a few days late, there's no human to call and talk to. An eviction is filed against you. And before they knew it, they were now living in a studio-sized hotel room at Extended Stay America. In the span of 8 months, they spent $17,000 on their room. That is more than double what they had been paying for the 2-bedroom apartment that they were just evicted from. So, I mean, as you were describing it, it truly is like, I mean, dystopian is a cliche to throw around, but there's no other word. It is a nightmarish scenario where there is nowhere to turn.
I want to pull out a little bit, but what have you, like, in the time that you've done this reporting and the book comes out, like, have you followed up with some of these folks? Like, what happens to these people?
Yeah, I have stayed in very, very close contact with all of them. We are in touch every week, sometimes every day. Like, we're still in very close contact. One of the conditions for their participation in the book was that I would protect their privacy, and also, so like we use pseudonyms in the book to protect their privacy, and especially the children. And also that like what is contained in the book would be more or less what I talk about and describe. But having said that, I will just say, without getting into specifics, that, you know, as much as I wanted their stories to have a happy ending, and as much as, you know, my editor, like, just for readability, to not leave readers in this state of desperation and just despair, to give some happy endings. I mean, Maurice and Natalia, when the book ends, are the closest, I think, to having a happy end. They actually get into an apartment, but their dreams of homeownership, they realize, are dead. So that's very hard. Since then, all of the families have continued to struggle. They have, even with readers and myself, you know, trying to offer financial support and other types of support, many of them, like, their credit scores are just too low. It shows that, like, what people need is not a GoFundMe. They don't need necessarily just an infusion of cash, as important as money is. Like, what we need is like widespread systemic change. And they have just continued to sort of experience the vicissitudes of belonging to the renter class in the United States.
And what you're just, oh, sorry, Sam, go ahead.
Well, I just want to say, you know, the Biden administration, and this is sort of like, you know, one slice, but this kept occurring to me in the context of Celeste, in terms of like credit scores and whatnot. The Biden administration had eliminated medical debt from a credit score, and the Trump administration just reversed that. And so you have a whole host of of people. I mean, I have no idea what the numbers we're talking about, who just in one day, all of a sudden can no longer qualify to rent an apartment. And then it just becomes an incredible spiral where you have these like sort of I don't know what else to say, like these parasitical business entities that are there to just like, we're going to exploit the shit out of this now.
Yeah, I think that is what was so striking, is that at every single step in these families' journeys, as documented in this book, there are entire business models designed not just to profit off their insecurity and to capitalize on it, but to really exacerbate it, to ensure that this crisis of housing and homelessness is not meaningfully addressed. And in that sense, I think that we really have to reckon with that profit motive lurking, and not just the private equity firms, but the co-signing companies, all of these entities, the application fees that families have to pay just to apply for an apartment with no guarantee they'll be that their application will be approved, they lose hundreds of dollars per application just in applying these non-refundable fees. So homelessness has become big business in this country. And until we really confront that, I think, it's not going to end. And it's not enough to just say we need to build more housing. We need to let the market do its thing. We need to cut regulation, cut the red tape, and then the market will sort of take care of these needs. No, we have to address it at its source, which to me is not to put too fine a point on it, but it's capitalism. It is the fact that the ability to stay housed in this country has been left to a system, and a system that has really no financial incentive in keeping them stable, that is really militating against the security at every turn. And I think that is very much
the entire incentive is to keep them trapped in this cycle. I mean, it's like like payday loan companies. I mean, it has the same dynamic of like, the more, once we get you in our clutches, like you have less and less chance of avoiding our clutches.
Exactly. I mean, there's that famous Baldwin quote about, how extremely expensive it is to be poor in America. I think what these families' experiences illustrate is sort of the flip side of that, which is how extremely lucrative all of this insecurity has become for some.
Yeah, and you hinted at it there, just about this is not being a supply problem. This is a problem of overcommodification. And you have these companies like Blackstone that are just buying up these single family homes, and it also gives an opportunity for them to orient. Well, I mean, that's about how purchasing homes and less about maybe some of these more apartment buildings, but it's still the same dynamic that you describe, which is just like, the problem is that all the power lies with landlords and corporations and none with tenants.
That's right. I don't know if you guys remember, but during the pandemic, in the early days of the pandemic, there were these two brothers in Tennessee who were driving around buying up hand sanitizer at every Dollar General they could find. And they rented a U-Haul and they stockpiled all of this hand sanitizer in there. And they made headlines. They were rightly vilified. There were calls for them to be prosecuted. And I remember thinking at that time, when I was in the middle of this reporting, that is what we've allowed housing to become in this country. We have allowed for it to be hoarded up, essentially thrown in a U-Haul truck, and then auctioned off to the highest bidder. And we don't call that by its proper name, which is price gouging. We just call that supply and demand economics. We say that, this scarcity has produced this need. Never mind the ways that scarcity itself has been arguably engineered. But that scarcity has produced a condition where this fundamental human necessity is just being auctioned off to the highest bidder. We see it really clearly, like after the wildfires in California, where landlords were jacking up rents overnight by 100%, 120%. And again, there's justified outrage at that. But I think what I'm trying to suggest is that is just the normal rental market in widening swaths of America today. In Atlanta, in Nashville, in Charlotte, that is what it is like to be a renter. Rents being jacked up way past the rate of inflation, past the rate of what it would cost to cover, growing insurance costs and property taxes, just because they can get away with it.
Let's talk about how race mixes with this, because both from your book and from some of the interviews I have read with you, you've outlined how in the context of Atlanta, it was something, I think it was like 93% of people who are unhoused, not necessarily officially, but within the context of this sort of netherworld are Black, but that it really is the most marginalized, economically deprived cohort of people in various cities, and that who that cohort changes based upon what city it is. Could you go into that to that dynamic?
Yeah, it's a great question. Because when I started this project, I really wanted to have, to sort of like check all these demographic boxes. I wanted to have this diversity of subjects where, the white working class character, family, individual. And as I began reporting, as I was standing in line at these food pantries on Saturday morning, every single person in line was Black. And as you mentioned, in a city that is no longer majority Black. Atlanta once was majority Black, but it no longer is. It's about, I believe, 46, 47% Black now. 93% of families who are homeless in this city are Black. So in many ways, to find that one family somewhere off, who is homeless right now would be really forced, because this is what homelessness looks like in Atlanta. The racialized character of housing precarity and homelessness is absolutely pronounced. And as you mentioned, it will take a different form in different cities and different regions. I reported a magazine story several years ago in Salinas, California, where the overwhelming majority of people who were homeless were migrant families and Latino farm workers. So it does vary. In Minnesota, where I recently was, it's Indigenous and Native American families and individuals, but the racialized character is there. And there's a moment in the book where Natalia, she has enrolled in an associate's degree program at Georgia State. She's reading this history book, and her eyes are being opened. She has this moment of revelation where, in reading about, sort of the post-Reconstruction period in America, and you had millions of men, women, and children who were freed, emancipated from slavery, into a country where they were systematically deprived of property rights, of ownership rights. She's realizing that is where her own story, her own experience of housing insecurity begins. And, and that was a revelation for me too, because the Wikipedia version of homelessness and housing insecurity in America, it starts with, it's basically a white story. It begins in the colonial era, and then through the Civil War with, white soldiers returning home, but their homes are no longer there, and on through, Jacob Riis's Great Army of Tramps, in the lead up to the Depression and so forth. That is kind of the official story of homelessness in America. But I think there's a different story we can tell where, again, millions of people are forced into a labor economy of low wages, rent, and debt. And that has just continued through a history of redlining, of restricted covenants, of all sorts of practices that have just again and again perpetuated dispossession, displacement, and discrimination. And that, I believe, is what has produced that 93% statistic.
Is there, and I mean, I would imagine the lack of political power is both racialized and obviously a function of just the material deprivation. And so it's much easier for it to be submerged as a political issue, and particularly when on the other side of that, you have people making a lot of money who definitely have access to state lawmakers, to city lawmakers, to federal lawmakers. And to the extent that they're advocating for anything, it is nothing that's going to stop this cycle, because that's how they're enriching themselves.
Yeah. I remember during the reporting after, and this is something that happens toward the end of the book, after about a dozen families are evicted at gunpoint from this extended stay hotel, Efficiency Lodge. They're evicted from gunpoint because they have lost their jobs. They can't pay their hotel rent. And the hotel hires this private militia basically to come in, point semi-automatic weapons in the faces of children and their parents, forcing them out of the rooms that they've lived in some cases for years, forcing them out. And a few days after that, I was with all of these families at a nearby park. A local group called Housing Justice League was trying to organize these residents, these families against against the owner of this property, trying to organize them, trying to organize protests. And it was the same day that the election results were announced, that Biden had won. And at that time, Georgia was on the verge of turning blue, and there was all this excitement in certain, my neighborhood, the neighborhood I live in around that, or in progressive circles. And I remember thinking, standing with these families, they are completely off the radar of both parties. The abandonment of these families has been a bipartisan project, a bipartisan phenomenon. And, they couldn't have cared less standing in that park that this person had just won the presidency and not this person. And I don't want to be glib about that, because there are actual differences. But, over the next 4 years, through the Biden years, the circumstances that families like them were going through changed not at all. And a caseworker in the book, Carla Wells, I really appreciate something she says. She has been in the trenches of homeless services for many years. And she basically says, what my clients need, yes, they need money. Yes, they need resources. But what they need more than anything is power. They feel powerless to even understand what is happening to them. Like, why can't we just have a roof over our head? Why can't we just know from one night to the next where me and my children are going to be living? Just a complete and utter lack of power. And for her, that is the most devastating fact about what these families are experiencing.
How much of what they're experiencing do they perceive as systemic, and how much of it do they perceive as a function of their own poor life choices or something like that? Because I just remember, I think it was Nomad Land. I can't remember the book, but that was
Nomad Land, Jessica Bruder's.
Yeah. Yes, we interviewed them. I feel like 5-10 years ago. And one of the things that they sort of really recognized, and this is a lot of people lost their homes during the housing crisis, was that almost to a person, they did not perceive, at least for a long time, that there was anything systemic about this, that it was all a function of, I made bad decisions, I got unlucky, or whatever it was, that there was no sense of that.
I think one of the things that was hardest for me in spending all of this time with these families day after day after day was seeing the shame that especially the parents internalized about what they were going through. Even though we would sit for hours and hours and I would be trying to show them, look at the larger picture here. This is not your fault. You are doing everything you're supposed to do. You are working your ass off. There are not enough hours in the week for you to work. You are working 2 jobs, 3 jobs. You are doing everything you are supposed to do in this country to have just stability, and it's not there, and it's not your fault. And even though I would say that, the shame was still there. It was just omnipresent for them. And it makes me think of this. There was an article written, I believe in the late 80s or early 90s by Peter Marcuse, the son of Herbert Marcuse. Peter Marcuse is a brilliant thinker on housing in America. He's largely neglected today, which is a shame. But he had an article in the Socialist Review, I believe it was, called Neutralizing Homelessness. And what he's talking about there is the way that homelessness, this crisis that was mounting back then, that had just exploded in the United States, how it had been neutralized, how it had been stripped of its properly political, economic implications and root causes, and instead had become a story about individual pathology and about life choices and about mental illness and addiction and housing and the economy and racist, a history of racist housing policy. All of that had sort of been left out, and homelessness as a phenomenon had been neutralized. And I think that is what is happening when these families, despite even knowing the larger picture, seeing it, it's still, there's a leap to embracing that. And And I think in the same way that until recently in this country, healthcare was also kind of depoliticized. Like if you went bankrupt because you had cancer, and you couldn't afford your medical bills, that was seen as like, well, you should have made better decisions, instead of, no, this is a reflection of how of this uniquely American malady that is utterly avoidable and preventable. Like in the same way, I think housing and homelessness has yet to be properly politicized in that way, even though an entire movement of tenant organizing and housing justice is helping to change that.
We should say that Trump's executive order issued last week, it seems to me, does exactly, pushes that narrative dramatically. It literally, I think the first line in purpose and policy: endemic vagrancy, disorderly behavior, sudden confrontations, violent attacks. It's all, the implication is that that people are homeless because they're on drugs. They're homeless because they have a mental or emotional problems. The overwhelming majority of these individuals, it says, of the people who are homeless on a single night, 275,000, which of course just means like not, on the streets or not in a shelter. It's just a drop in the bucket. Overwhelming majority of these individuals are addicted to drugs, have a mental condition, or both. 2/3 of homeless individuals report having regularly used hard drugs. This is all a way to marginalize people and to obfuscate the fact that this is a systemic problem.
Yeah. And it's nothing new in this country. Since the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, when mass homelessness first erupted, this has been the tactic. And it's a tactic that then went through successive presidential administrations to basically control the narrative around why are so many people deprived of housing in this country. And of course, they don't see it as being deprived of housing. They just see it as kind of a choice to not have a home. This is nothing new. This is an old tactic. And I was really surprised to go back to that earlier moment in the 80s when all of this was first emerging, to find that the Reagan administration actually actively shaped even the research that could be conducted on homelessness. There was an article in the journal Nature called Reagan versus the Social Sciences, because like ethnographers, sociologists, demographers, public health scholars who wanted to study the effects of racist housing policy, who wanted to study the effects of the gutted social safety net, the gutting of low-income housing support and so forth on homelessness, they were denied grants. And the people who were funded were people who were looking at the link between mental illness and addiction or alcoholism and homelessness. The National Institute for Mental Health became the primary purveyor of knowledge about homelessness in America. And that attempt to control the narrative was successful. By the end of the 80s, the New York Times and CBS News conducted a poll of New Yorkers at random asking what causes homelessness. And the number one answer was psychological problems. The number two answer was a refusal to work, laziness. Not a single person mentioned housing. And meanwhile, the fastest growing segment of the homeless population at that time were children under the age of 6. So there is a direct line of continuity from that obfuscation, that concerted attempt to obscure the true causes of homelessness and what we're seeing today. And it's violent, it's horrific, and the attempt to just get people off the street, to push them out of sight, or, as will probably be the case, to push them into these concentration camps where they may be forced into free labor. That will do nothing. That will maybe address the tip of the iceberg, those who are on the street, but that will do nothing to address the rest of the iceberg under the water surface, which is in many ways what my book is about, this vast iceberg under the surface. And it will just continue to come out into the open because the root causes are not being addressed.
Trump,
Go ahead.
Trump and Kushner, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, both slumlords. Trump had cut his teeth, I think, as depicted in that movie with the Apprentice, with Roy Cohn, because he was being sued over discriminatory housing policy. The Trumps were, and then Kushner was a more like advanced model of this, of milking all of his tenants for their worth with these decrepit housing developments. And it just, to me, it feels like also orienting our economy around home ownership and how heavily financialized that has been is a big part of this as well. It has widened the gap between owners, which include landlords and increasingly private equity and these big financial firms, and people who are trying to get housing just to survive. Is that the big story here? Is also how the banks and home ownership has widened this gap?
Yeah, I mean, home ownership is becoming elusive for people for whom it was very much within reach, a decade ago, 2 decades ago. So that, the ranks of the renter class, and not just the temporary renter class, but a semi-permanent renter class, the ranks of that population is growing by the day. Some numbers that are just outrageous. Like right now in America, there are about 53 million workers who are earning under $10.30 an hour. Since 1985, rents have outpaced income gains by 325%. These kinds of statistics show us that this is not just some bizarre aberration that I'm documenting in this book. These families are not some marginal phenomenon. This is the condition in many cases of renting as a poor and and increasingly a middle class or downwardly mobile middle class member of the society. And this latest budget, the big beautiful budget, it just for detention centers alone, it's allocating $45 billion. That's more than 4 times what the US government spent last year in building new affordable housing. And so, I think I'm not a politician, but if I were a politician, I would be proclaiming every day that we are spending 4 times as much on cages, on putting human beings in cages, as we are on just putting people in homes and building homes. So, there are just these realities that once you see them, it's I'm an anthropologist. My background is in anthropology before I was a journalist. And anthropologists, our basic move is to take the familiar and make it strange, to seem sort of bizarre. And nowhere is that more urgent, I think, than when it comes to housing. How utterly bizarre is it that this is what we're doing? This is what we're doing with this fundamental human necessity. And so, yeah, I didn't think when I finished this book that it could get any worse, but what we're seeing right now is gasoline just being poured on an already disastrous situation.
And what you said earlier about what happened during the Reagan administration and the impact of it 40 some odd years later and continued impact. I think, when we start to see these things, why are they not taking any more data in the Department of Education? Why are they not taking any more data in terms of EPA and climate change? All of these things are designed to hide the reality of what's going on. Very often a function of capitalism. The vast majority of roads lead back to that because we have incentivized the wrong things in our society and empowered the wrong people. I can't encourage people to read your book enough. There are in the final chapters, there's policy prescriptions and stories of attempts to organize, which are very difficult for folks who are having to struggle with so many material issues. That the idea of starting a political journey to gain political power, is secondary to making sure that your kids have a place to live, and your family has a place to live. But it's fascinating, and I think at one point the the housing as an investment vehicle, and providing housing as a burgeoning business, is in many ways the biggest, if not maybe perhaps not the only, but certainly close to the only culprit. Brian Goldstone, the book is There's No Place for Us, Working in Homeless in America. We will put a link to that at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description. Thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for this great conversation.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.